Good afternoon, everyone. I am Anne Cheng. Welcome to our Law Tech Talk for this semester. And today we are very, very honored to have Professor Tanikawa of Akita University giving a Law Tech Talk for us. Professor Tanikawa is a veteran journalist, and he has been working with New York Times, International Herald Tribune, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. And before that, I've been searching his article online, and he has been writing very interesting stuff, mainly on higher education in Japan. And in Japan and in the US, that he touches on many interesting issues like women studying science and how that will affect their future, especially in finding future partner in Japan. And very interesting stories. And Professor Tanikawa was educated in Sophia University, in Harvard Law School, in Texas, University of Texas, and in Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And other than writing journal articles, he has been very prolific in writing academic articles also that he has published in Journalism Studies and International Journal of Communication. And today he will share his views on a very important issue about this evolving status of the press, and he will use the model of Professor Jack Balkin to do an analysis.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Afternoon, my name is Miki Tanikawa. I'm very pleased and honored to be here this afternoon, and thank you for coming, and thank you for the speak. So if I may just get straight to my topic, I've entitled my speech this way: Triadic Model of Free Speech Regulation and Diminishing the Influence of Political State. So I'm going to talk about the press, how the press influence is going down in international studies. So this is my outline. I'll go one by one. So to preface my speech, today, news media's ability to play its conventional watchdog role is seriously in doubt everywhere. And all of this happening under the new environment, technologically speaking, where digital platforms have come to play a powerful role in technology and almost economically as well. So in this study, I'm looking at the fourth state, the role of the fourth state in the digital era, in this evolving environment. So broadly, what is my perspective here? So the economic decline of the press is quite well known. So, and this is what I might call techno-financial explanation as to why the press is losing its influence. So the digital platforms became a gateway for people to access news and information people gather from the computers and smartphones. And that gateway has sucked advertising dollars away from the traditional media, precipitating the decline of traditional and legacy news media, newspapers or television. So that is very well known, especially in the journalism circle. But I'm turning my attention to what I would call techno-legal explanation to the threat posed to the institutional press, which plays an important role in democracy. So here I bring in the free speech triangle perspective or theory put forward by Jack Balkin, who's a legal scholar. So he explains this in terms of free speech triangle model and how this has transformed the way speech regulation takes place generally. But he doesn't talk about the press per se, but he talks about the new framework through which freedom of speech principle operates. So a little bit about the fourth estate. What do I mean by fourth estate? want to go a little bit light on the historical explanation. Well, many of you know how this term came to be, like how the Thomas Carlyle, the reference statement by Edmund Burke talking about this emerging influence in the parliament. You see people seated on the gallery yonder. They're setting aside the formal powers of the government and become almost equal in power. But I'd rather skip all of it and just fast forward to how fourth estate is conceptualized today. So we know that we have three powers of the government: judicial, judiciary, executive, legislature. They check each other, but there's a fourth estate, fourth power that checks the power of the government. So that's what we know as the fourth estate. So basically, when people go to the poll and cast their vote to decide who is going to be running the government, so that is the crux of the democracy. That's the most important. But then, based on what information do people vote, you need an independent source of information to decide who should be in the position of power in the government. So for democracy to really work, function, you need independent source of government, which the press supposedly provide. Also, once the government is in place, can they do whatever they want during their tenure? No, they have to be accountable to the people who voted for them. So the press will keep a scorecard on how the government is doing. So if they do something wrong, the press will catch that and expose that to the public. So the fourth state, in sum, it characterizes media organizations, news organizations, collectively as an institution. And it describes the press as sitting alongside the formal government, and it has the power to challenge independently. So if this form of power is declining, we know how that is happening. So, and another thing I would add to this characterization of the fourth state is there are many presses. News media organizations are many in their position and how they're structured and what they think about. But to say fourth estate, it encapsulates the many and varied press collectively as the force that represents the voices of the many and varied public. So you have many different kinds of presses, but we collectively characterize them as an. So it's a very sweeping way of capturing this. That's why I use fourth estate. And again, fourth estate is conceptualized the counterweight to the powerful governmental power. So government is potentially very powerful, and therefore you cannot monitor them enough, cannot check them enough. That's very offensive. Now, so what is the speech triangle in the digital era that is new? First of all, it goes without saying that so much communication takes place through digital communication platforms. And today, it's probably not an exaggeration to say they're about the only forms for speech making, almost. And the platforms being a private company, they impose rules as to how to use them. So they are creating rules which the users, ordinary people who want to express themselves through speech, they have to obey. And well, I might just switch. So Jack Balkin has said our practical ability to speak is subject to the decisions of the private internet. Private governance by social media companies has now become essential to digital freedom of expression, but they're not the government. So this brings in that triangle structure we need to think of. Okay, so let me skip over to this. So this is the schematic that Jack Balkin presents, and I just took it directly from his paper. So you have three actors in this structure. You have nation states on the upper left side. It could be nation state, it can be super government organization like EU, for example. It could be international organization, to some extent. And then you have technology companies on the right side. And there's so many different players. It's not just social media, but it's web hosting services, search engines, ISPs, even payment systems. Because payments, if you remove a payment system, you can stop people from speaking effectively sometimes. So you have this whole new gamut of players on the technology side that regulates speech in a way. And then you have at the bottom users of speech. So these three players, they struggle for control, but the new picture we are witnessing, the technology companies are playing a much bigger role. They're playing a role that did not even exist to regulate speech. So users have to obey the terms of service set forth by social media companies, for example. So that's one big chunk of new regulatory structure on the right side. But also, the government sometimes make laws that tell the technology players to behave in a manner that is consistent with the existing laws of the country. Or they may specifically tell the tech players to do certain things. And I'll touch upon this later. The government sometimes informally tells the tech players to do what they should be doing, unbeknownst to the users. So that's one big issue. So we have this triangular structure that is quite new. And thus, leading Balkin to comment, our ability to speak in the digital age is shaped by the result of the struggles for control and co-optation. So it's not that ordinary citizens have no say in this. I mean, democratically, they can put pressure on the government to change the law. They can put pressure on technology companies because they're customers, basically. So there's an interaction among the three. Now, that's the new era of speech regulation. Let's contrast that to pre-internet era, where the regulation was dyadic, meaning two sides. So speech regulation occurred as a matter between the government and the speaker, including the press. So just like this. So the government, if they wanted to regulate speech, would directly regulate the speakers. Nothing in between. So people speaking in the public streets, in the squares, in the park, or pamphleteers printing print and distributing them through public places, through mailboxes, or news media distributing printed products, TV stations airing programs. All of this still happens. So there's still a dyadic form of regulation, but this is more of a traditional way of regulating, which is switching to the dyadic model. So in this new era, the triangle became the all-important structure in which the regulation of speech takes place. So under this structure, government regulation of the speakers might be carried out in an opaque manner. So it's in the background, as Balkin says, because the regulation is indirect, as we have seen in that thematic. Now, by the way, where's the press in this new image of speech regulation? Can you find it? Actually, it's there. You have to look for it. Right there. Yeah, there it is. There it is. So it says legacy media. So media is buried at the bottom. And it's sitting alongside the end users, citizens, civil society organizations, hackers, and trolls. So the press is now relegated to and treated like hackers and trolls in a way. So the all-important self-respecting press used to look like this, the whole structure like this. Now it looks like this. So this is how I would describe it when I originally saw it. Now, there's a caveat to making this comparison, because this is not a explanation of speech regulation. This is a different kind of diagram. However, I would still say this and this is similar because in the previous model, what is the role of press? What can press do? All it can do is speak. It can provide information to the people, but it can do nothing else, really. So we're not talking about a very different kind of image here. So there is some direct comparison that is possible. And also, under the previous model, there's nothing that stands in the way between the press and the government, or press and the people. So if press communicating to the government or to the audience, nothing would stand in the way to cut its influence. So that's a major difference. So in the previous dyadic model of regulation, the government could still regulate the press if they wanted to. So press saying something to threaten national security in a very direct and immediate way, they could stop the press. But if the government stopped the press, whether it's print or TV, it's so obvious that you're doing it. So you're doing it in such a broad daylight. There's some explaining to do. But why are you stopping? Why are you blocking the press and stopping them from printing newspapers? So the technology companies are now the new powers, and under the system of triangular regulation of speech, the press is instigated first and foremost to the digital platform. So that's new. And also, the government regulation of tech firms is working behind the scenes to influence the outcome. So that's deserves attention. There's something always happening between government and tech companies, the regulation happening, that could indirectly influence the influence of the press. So I can also talk about the technology implication of what the government does alone, but I can speak to that in the context of surveillance, confidential sources later. Okay, so it's fair to say governments became more powerful under the Triadic model, generally speaking. So under the triangular structure, the government ended up increasing its power as it can control the tech firms, can tell tech firms what to do to a certain extent, and jockey for more powerful decisions vis-a-vis other actors, whether it's civil society organizations or the press. It has more tools to play, either in a very obvious way or in a very indirect or hidden way, without public knowing. So surveillance, for example. So surveillance, government can flex its muscles by collecting and surveilling vast amounts of data passing through digital platforms and telecommunication systems, and accumulate the data and later tap onto that information to find out certain things that the press is doing. But let me come back to that later when I talk about press shield laws. So it deserves to pay attention how the top two prongs of the triangle, they forge a certain relationship upon all actors, including press. And little by little, they can change the dynamic, the powers that each player ends up having. So Balkin has said appropriately, the long-term trend has been the merger of the infrastructures of speech, regulation, and surveillance. So the long-term trend is the upper determinant. So he's referring to how this can happen little by little by little by little. So in exactly what manner is the press strangulated due to technology? I'd like to give 3 examples. So one would be how digital platforms carries out content moderation. So press reporting conducted on social media and other internet platforms, they could be removed, either automatically or by someone making that decision. So let me give you some examples. So there's been many cases like this, and maybe there's some local examples here, which I may not know. So two famous cases are these. So one is in 2018, a Texas newspaper called Vindicator, they posted Declaration of Independence, different sections of it, bit by bit, working toward July 4th celebration. When the passage referring to merciless Indian savages went up, Facebook promptly took it down. So Facebook subsequently recognized this was a mistake, and they reinstated the content. But I can tell from being a journalist myself, this is quite shocking. Whatever you decide to report to the public is taken away through technology. That's very shocking for journalists. How can that ever happen? So it was a mistake, but sometimes it's not a mistake. There's a legal requirement that causes this to happen. Another famous example is the Tung girl photo. So this was famous Vietnam era war photo, picturing a girl fleeing from the scenes, fiery scenes of a missile attack. So this one was agreed because it represented nudity. So Facebook forbids nudity of all kinds, at least at this time. So it was automatically removed. But this was a case of basically a piece of journalism, photographic journalism, being filtered by Facebook and failing to reach the audience of content moderation. Okay. Another issue that comes from technology that suppresses the press is source protection. So there's a very strong tradition, legal tradition, of source protection in many countries, democratic countries in the world, in recognition of the function of the press, the function that confidential sources play in facilitating the watchdog role of journalism. And journalist shield laws are a good example of this. So reporters, when they speak to whistleblowers or secret information about the government or government officials doing something wrong or abusive, they can report that, but then they're not required to identify sources, even in the court. This is not a absolute immunity, it's a qualified immunity, but in many countries, there are reporters' shield laws. There are in many states, most states in America, there are in Japan. And in Europe, there's a very strong tradition against disclosing confidential sources. But when government is so capable of accessing information through digital communication platforms and telecommunications, what they can do basically is that they can search from the entire sea of data that is available. Well, they can ask communication companies to keep the data and then access their database whenever they want to. They can routinely tap into, well, they can ask email providers to cough up data, and journalist communication might be just easily caught up in the cobweb of government surveillance. So leakers in the government can easily be identified. So if the government can find out who leaked the information, they don't have to bother with a court order of any kind. This can happen. The government can snoop on journalist activities through things like surveillance camera on the streets and the buildings. So they can access that kind of data, which might be held by private companies. But if the government can somehow find a way to get them to cooperate, they can gain access to that kind of thing and just find out who the sources were. So again, they don't have to go through the journalists, but they can find out who the speakers were directly, and then there's no such thing as confidential anymore. Okay. So this is a triangular issue, as I was saying earlier, because the government is better able to thwart journalism via technology. And the so-called encryption, which journalists sometimes use to prevent people from finding out who the sources were, is not actually effective. So journalists don't really trust the encryption system to shield themselves from anybody like government, law enforcement, finding out who they were speaking to. So it's again, triangular issue with the top fronts, government and technology front, working in tandem to oppress the users, which are journalists in this case. So the combination of governmental powers and tech working to suppress the news organization. So that's the structure we're looking at once again. So it's an accurate, the speech triangle is a good portrayal of the new power structure, I would say, where citizens and press powers are weakened. So this is the point that Balkin doesn't necessarily make. He basically treats all speakers the same. But if you think about the fourth estate and the role it's supposed to play, you really need to think especially about this problem of press being weakened significantly under this triangular structure. So that's basically my point in this study. Okay, one more example of this triangular structure working to weaken press is this. So troll army and online harassment of journalists, and they can really wear down journalists. So there's been a lot of studies and reports about how journalists are undermined, they're weakened because of these things, which didn't happen in the past. And the attackers may be just completely private. They may have nothing to do with the government, but we have seen instances where the attacks have come from government actors, or government actors somehow indirectly involved in executing attack against journalists. So to the extent that the government actor is involved in carrying out these kinds of harassment against journalists, this is also a related issue. Committee to Protect Journalists has been quite active in reporting these kind of cases. So journalists receiving this kind of threat and attack, even physical threat. Excuse me. So one female journalists have especially been vulnerable in this juncture. So it's one of the biggest issues confronting journalists in preventing them from being active in reporting. And we've also seen a scenario where the government is not ordering private trolls to attack journalists, but encouraging and telling them indirectly to go after journalists. So we have seen that with Donald Trump and people who just decided to give up doing their reporting work. And there is a legal argument to be made that this is the case of a state actor influencing a troll or problematic behavior that influences the journalist. So state accomplice, state is involved as an accomplice. So accomplice doctrine is brought in to explain how you can blame the government. You can go to the government legally, possibly, to make a case. Okay, so it's a deprivation of speech that we see as a result of all this is the tantamount to suppression by the government of the press. If you look at the substance of the issue. Now, finally, I want to explain how the government, the different approaches that government takes to regulate tech. And I categorized it into two methods. Now, I decided to change the wording here. So instead of saying direct regulation versus indirect regulation, I think the better way of characterizing what I'm about to talk about is informal regulation, formal regulation, number one, and informal regulation. To distinguish from these, from what I've been talking about in terms of indirect triangular. So, but anyway, let me say, so the first kind of approach that a government takes in regulating is formal regulation. So this could happen through legislation or formal regulation, and most typically, we know, intermediary liability law, like Section 230, DMCA, e-commerce directive in the EU, which is now being replaced by DMA and DSA, as you know. So this kind of regulation is formal and transparent, I guess, but the way in which it happens can be quite murky. So to take the example of, for example, of wood call freedom case. So this was not a press that was involved, but it could be. So some of you may know that there's a FOSTA law, anti-trafficking law, which came into, which passed several years ago, and it was kind of an amendment to CEA Section 230, which immunized the digital platform from liabilities. This one narrowed the scope of immunity of the platforms by making platforms responsible for certain kinds of content relating to sex trafficking. So as a result of this law, Craigslist decided not to let certain sex workers advertise their services on Craigslist. Now, the plaintiffs in this case brought a litigation arguing that FOSTA law is a violation of First Amendment. But the court ruled that wood call actually does not have a standing because Craigslist is a private actor and they acted in their private capacity to remove the advertising. The advertising itself is legal, almost completely legal. Craigslist decided not to ever let them advertise because they were being extra careful. So when you have a private player being extra careful not to trample on the law, they would err on the side of caution and eliminate or stop certain kind of content from remaining on their site. So when they do that, the plaintiff in this case cannot complain it to Craigslist, and they cannot say to the court the law is against First Amendment either, because Craigslist in this case acted as a private capacity to prevent the sex advertising to be on Craigslist. So the court said, you guys have no standing in this case because you say this is against First Amendment, but Craigslist is a private company, so they can do whatever they want. So if your speech is stopped in this way, there's really no recourse. And it's not clear if you should be suing the government or if you should sue the Craigslist. Indirect or rather informal regulation. So this is more problematic. Jawboning by the government. So putting pressure on tech companies to remove certain content. Or else there will be future regulation that is very burdensome on you. So here, the government can only use threats to get certain behavior carried out by private platforms. But they don't want certain kind of speech, whether it's hate speech or terror speech or extreme speech. They can ask tech companies to remove them using a threat, rather than actually going through a formal process of legislation. So this is a voluntary, self-regulation, but it's really the case of government laundering their action and disguising them as private behavior of private companies. So these are two very well-known cases. One is WikiLeaks, another is Backpage. Let me just briefly explain WikiLeaks because many of you may know this. So about 10 years ago, the Obama administration put pressure on tech companies that work with WikiLeaks. So when WikiLeaks put diplomatic cables that are secret information by government, especially the US government, this was very embarrassing for the US government. So in order to stop Julian Assange and WikiLeaks from further divulging information about the government, the US government officials put pressure on tech companies to stop hosting content by or cut funding to WikiLeaks. So this is another case of jawbone because you're not directly regulating, but you're putting informal pressure for them to stop speaking. This is a case that is closest to media being suppressed. So WikiLeaks is not news media in a traditional sense, but they're kind of like a journal in a way. Right? So this could happen to news media as well. I'll be happy to explain Backpage case also, but in this one, the government actors, so Jack escaped law, clearly, because his action was thought to be a government behavior of the. One more example is from the EU. There's a hate speech code of conduct agreement between European Commission and American platform companies, Facebook, Google, and whatnot. And so the latter, the digital platform companies came to an agreement to introduce certain rules and community guidelines, prohibit promotion of incitement, violence, and this was fully in line with Commission's agenda to spread hate speech and terrorism. And so you have a case where an agreement between the government and the private companies track existing EU laws, but it can't go not as law, but as a private agreement between government and digital platform companies, which resulted in kind of service between tech companies and users. So the government is nowhere to be seen from the public, but it's very much a result of government action. But again, so it's government being in the background and not out in the open as the initiator of this regulation. So you can say, in another case of government laundering their action and presenting that as a private behavior. Okay, so according to Stephanie Keller, who made this particular argument, jawboning in its subtle form makes state action hard to trace and hard to understand the limits. The resulting bargain between the regulators and the platforms affect user speech rights, but users could otherwise sue the government for violations. They won't be doing that because of how they actually disguise the subject. Okay, so my third conclusion here is that government can bypass constitutional limits by deputizing private platforms or censors without knowing and without people being able to see very visibly how all of this process has taken place. So if they can do this to the press, it's quite problematic. Okay, so in conclusion, I would say, conclusion of of all of what I've discussed so far, the journalist influence society is diminishing, not just because their business model is failing, but because they're losing influence due to techno-regulatory, techno-legal challenges they're facing in this new era of triangular speech regulation. Also, techno-regulatory challenges involve how the government uses its executive powers to co-opt technology firms to leverage its strength vis-a-vis the news media. It's more hidden because it's indirect and it's triangular. So news media's power is weakened by the technology firms, but it's happening also by the government exerting its power over and through the digital tech firm. So what's noteworthy is how the government and tech firms working together to chip away at the power of the news media, bit by bit, by bit by bit. So this transaction, a precedent, it can be most clearly demonstrated if you compare to the old fourth estate model of speech regulation. We are familiar with until the digital era came along. Okay, so that's pretty much it in terms of presenting the problems. Here are the possible solutions that I have to this issue. So I have to admit, this is the part where I'm still working on how to formulate the solution aspect of it. So I'm wondering, yeah, maybe I should stop. Should I stop here, maybe, and take questions, if any, and any lack of clarity in my presentation, and then I can just quickly go over this, which is still a little bit fuzzy, but I do have some ideas what could possibly be the solutions to this problem.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for this very stimulating talk. I'm sure we have many questions. I myself have a lot of questions. Some probably related to the possible solutions, but maybe I let the floor exercise the right first before I raise those questions. So any questions or comments?
I got a question about the triangle model. Traditionally, we know that the fourth estate is not really it's not a singleton piece, right? The management level, the editorial board, the journalists themselves. So sometimes maybe we use the drawing term, the drawing or economic pressure can happen on the management level and then exerted to the journalists themselves. For example, one example in Hong Kong would be during the 2000s, TVB had the Hong Kong's largest television station has obtained non-disclosed footage of the Tiananmen massacre from a Spanish television station, but due to management pressure, they did not air it. So what I'm curious is how is the drawing pressure towards the management level and then towards the difference from such pressure towards the platform and then towards the journalists and civilians.
Yeah, indeed. So that it's not as if informal way of guiding the press did not exist in the past. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So that kind of thing happens in many countries where you do have a fairly high level of freedom of the press. So something like that has happened in Japan, as far as I can tell. It's more difficult to conceive of that in the United States, but even there, it's possible. So I would first say you're correct in stating that informal way of guiding the press existed in the past. I would say, especially in the case of television, because television has been regulated by the government. You're using, airwaves that are allotted by the government. So in the case of Japan, there's more informal guidance by the government over TV operators, yeah, for sure. I guess in the previous era, when the government informal regulation or informal guidance of the press, to the extent it happened, and if it was problematic, it could be the subject of another media reporting. So if one news media said it, so my understanding of cases come from Japan and South Korea to some extent. So if one news media did something, accepted government pressure or guidance, and if it was blatant, you would always have a different kind of media reporting on it. So if you have media diversity, like in Japan, for example, if a traditional media did something, like a TV station, for example, you would always, that is perceived as blatant, you would always have like a magazine reporting on it, for example. So I would say the familiar practice, if whatever the news media did crossed the line or blatant or going too far, it would be checked by another media. Not that you can trust that always, yes. But in previous models, things have been worked out that way, is my understanding. But I definitely do not mean to say informal government intervention did not happen in the past. But I think the difference is, in the tech realm, the way in which the government intervention or government working to diminish the influence of that happening more invisibly, and it's happening little by little by little, because you're changing the structure, you're changing the system more than engaging in particular conduct that could be damaging. In terms of government intervening in the press so that the press reporting that the audience receives is going to be different.
Any other questions?
But let me know if there are any. I think there are.
My pretty thought-provoking talk. But my concern is that if there is more, I'm going back to your possible solution, in fact, because where there are more control by the states, or say for a social media company itself, they are exerting their right to preempting such thing from happening through censorship. I think in that sense, it is pushing the end user, civilian and whatnot, to a more dangerous zone in the blockchain or dark web era, in which no regulation could be touched upon, or even things that could be stored in a more harmful way, or even become a certain, I don't know, like a zone for criminals to communicate through these kind of like off the regulatory platforms. So I do understand that. Like, I know for me, I don't want hate speech to be appearing on certain things, but of course, like, who are the arbiter of what hate speech or affinity of text, like content that violated community guidelines? Who be the arbiter? So like, I don't know. Like, for me, from what I'm seeing is that, like, I think the end user, of course, they will think of a new way should new regulatory things happen. I think as journalists, should the government choose to push these kind of regulations to forbid or to take away shield law, or to make things more transparent, to make the source transparent, for example. I think like it is up to us as citizens or civil society to think of new way of internet of privacy protection for our informant documents or whatnot, because exported too, because like if we're doing research, then somehow if the government choose to, intervene on our informant, then what are our way to protect our informant? So I don't know, like just a thought, because like this is very useful, but at the same time, like we are in Hong Kong, like the government choose to use the more, service way to, government security law, bam, shut things up, instead of the more hidden, like a more hidden way to deal with this kind of things. So I don't know. Yes, but this is very useful. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do think that so hate speech, for example, the way in which it emerges in people's and intervenes and affects people's daily lives is different under the current digital era than it is in the past. It's more worrisome if it appears here and there and interrupting people's everyday lives, affecting people and how they think. But if the press does reporting that is somehow perceived as hate speech and they're stopped from reporting, that is potentially problematic. So so the press does so many different kinds of reporting that using its institutional power, they can gain information and deliver that to the public, especially when it's important. So I come from the perspective that press has a particular role to play in providing critical information to the public. And when you are playing that traditional function, that has been helpful in revealing government secrets that needed to be revealed and causing outrage to the public, and rightly so. In that process, so my view is that there should be nothing that prevents that. It should go out to the public first and foremost. So if you screen the content of the press in the same way you screen it ordinary citizens, the public will miss a critical piece of information that they need to know about what the government is doing or what the powerful companies, corporations are doing. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. So basically, in the solution thing, the press reporting that comes through the digital platform should be not filtered at all. There should be a complete, it should be completely set aside. So one possibility is to register media in the platforms so that platform cannot intervene in the content for the press, for example. So any form of ex ante regulation, I find it problematic. In the case of the press, it should be ex post facto. So that has been the case throughout history. I think notice and takedown could work, but notice and takedown procedure is basically ex post facto. So coming from the point of view that press can sometimes provide critical information to the public that public should rightly need to come to know, to make a quick judgment about something that the government is doing. For that eventuality, the media report should be absolutely free from any kind of content.
I guess my question is, who exactly is the news media?
Yeah.
That is, do we count Facebook as news media, Twitter, Instagram? Because nowadays that the younger generation, they don't really read news from New York Times. They get the news from reading Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. So, but we have this huge problem of fake news, cyberbullying, revenge porn, and given your assumption of not regulating, and examples that you have been relying on are mainly about political speech, which we will easily agree that we should not regulate. And your argument of having notice and take down exposed regulation seems to be sound. But what about those current problems of fake news, cyberbullying? Will your analysis be different?
Yeah. So, well, there are many polls and research conducted on fake news and misinformation and disinformation. I think it's fair to say that on the whole, information emanating from traditional media organizations have been thought to be not problem-free, but generally trustworthy. So there are lots of findings that point to the fact that fake news and the nature, if you look at the nature of fake news, it's happening as a result of information coming from so many different sources, untrusted sources. So, but that's an empirical question. To what extent can you really determine that sources other than traditional news media is not trustworthy? I mean, a lot of information actually is trustworthy, coming from individuals, citizen journalists, and whatnot. And also, back to your question about who is the news media. So in the United States, they have shield law in most states. They even have federal shield laws, a little bit shaky, but there has been efforts made to define who the journalists are. So legally, they are actually defined. And it could be different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But journalists or news organizations are those organizations that are dedicated to reporting the news. They're dedicated to reporting what's happening in the society, and especially political news. So there are ways to define it, and sometimes you have to be a little bit formulaic in terms of who the news media are and who the journalists are. I think if you look at what the United Nations is doing, UNESCO has been particularly active in this regard. Their definition is a little bit expansive, broader than it has been in the past. So they include those people who are independent and those who are not necessarily making a living out of it. So there are existing definitions, either in the law or proposed model, that can give you guidance as to who the journalists are. So I believe there's a way to come up with an agreed ways to define who the journalists are, so that their information delivery, the way in which they can disseminate information to the public, is protected.
Any other question? Yes.
Sorry, like me again. So I understand Professor Tanikawa feel as you think that the news media should not be subject to any like hard form of interference, such as like I described the social media like taking down and those kind of censorship influence as hard form. So in a point of view that news media should not be subjected to this hard form of interference, but rather they should be put out any content they want, and those content might be subjected to other news media and the public's moderation.
Yes. So subsequently, they could be scrutinized. So they could be and could be scrutinized. But stopping before they peak could be a significant hindrance to free flow of information. So it really comes down to the question of how do you think of free flow of information that makes sure that those who are in power, especially those who are the government or powerful corporations, you have free flow of information reaching the public that will help them understand how the power is can be concentrated in the hands of government and private sector companies. So that could include the news media, but news media's job is to deliver that information. So that crucial source of information should be protected, at least insofar as their ability to deliver it to the public. So they can be and should be held accountable subsequent to the dissemination of information, as it always has been. So news media have been sued, they have laws for defamation, for violation of privacy. So those kinds of things should be there to protect citizens or protect government from undue use of information delivered by the news. So the news media shouldn't abuse their power. So there should be a check on that as well.
Maybe the last question. That is, how do you see the challenges brought by AI-generated content? That affects the journalism practice with AI in financial news, in sports news. So I'm not sure whether that for political news, that is so close to our hearts that if one day it becomes AI generated or partly being AI generated, and then probably at the back end there will be a lot of coding and dipping into indirect or informal regulation. That what you have in mind. So in that sense, that how do you see this prevalent trend? Would that bring in more problems, or actually it's easier to have solutions from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think that's adding another dimension that is a very complicated, knotty question for journalism. Generally speaking, it's seen more as a problem. Well, so first of all, I should say that when it comes to content, how the digital platforms have become a gatekeeper, a new gatekeeper of information for inside in general. It's critical in two senses. One is that they regulate information coming in and out. Another is they can promote or demote certain kind of content. So it's not just showing or not showing, but it's showing more of something, much more in a very accelerated way or decelerated way. So that has added to the opaqueness of information flow. So news media is tremendously affected by that, even without AI, how digital platforms can manipulate information. So if their content is not even reaching public because of the news media's ability to control the flow of it. Now, AI is probably adding a very complicated dimension to that, as it is to almost any kind of informational activity, be it music or art. So it's going to be interesting to see how that is going to play out well. And again, it's going to have economic influence. There's a certain realm of things that you can say it's only an economic impact. So news media is suffering because of the role that AI plays in helping or not helping news media from an economic model perspective. So I would, again, like to say we need to distinguish between the economic failure of the news media, which may accelerate by AI, but also the legal realm. So my preference is to go back to the fourth state model, where you really need an independent source of information that is institutionally empowered and healthy, so that you can balance the power of the government, who is becoming more powerful in the digital media and digital era.
Thank you. Because of the time, then I'm afraid we have to end here. Can I invite all of you to give a big hand? I'm sure that Professor can stay behind if you would like to ask more questions.
Yeah, I just like to say I'm here for another 2 months. So and I plan to audit some classes to be fun to interact with you. Tell me. I attended Boston, so quite recently. Here.
Thank you.